Awesome. Well, thanks so much for having me here today, and thanks for that warm introduction, Kim. I really appreciate it. I see a familiar face in the crowd. I haven't actually given this talk before, so I hope you'll forgive me as I have some notes on my phone. I want to share a little bit about why flying. So let me set up a story for you. At the last business I started, TellMe, we had raised over $200 million in capital from investors, and yet we had, at the time, no product and no revenue that we'd actually shipped yet. So it was an interesting time, 1999, to be raising money and as an entrepreneur, and a lot of challenges ahead of us. Now, ultimately, we did end up shipping product, and we were just about to start getting revenue when it became clear that the business model we have was not going to work. And then right around that same time that we had gone through our second round of layoffs, my girlfriend, my first serious adult relationship, dumped me. So I was kind of at a low point, quite frankly, and I thought, you know what? This will be a good time to pick up a new hobby, flying. And the nice thing about flying is you get in an airplane and you get up in the air and you're very focused on one thing: don't die. And you are not focused on all of the other things that may be troubling you in your life, like your girlfriend or things not going well in your business or whatnot. And as it turned out, though, the lessons I learned flying stuck with me later in life. They helped me both in business and in my personal life. And as Kim shared, the ending story for TellMe was quite a bit better than at the time that I started my flying lessons. So one of the things that I want to share, I'll take you through a few different things I learned as I was learning to fly and how we applied those things in business. So one of the most scary parts of learning to fly is what's called stall training. This is when you're in the airplane, and as Kevin was explaining earlier, the wings generate lift. And if the angle of attack on the wings is off, then they no longer generate lift, and that's called a stall. So one of the things your instructor will do is she or he will actually purposefully put the airplane into the stall. And you are then trained to push the nose forward and hit the, give it full gas and so on. But this is quite scary because while this is happening, there is an alarm bell going off, the stall warning horn that's going like, while you're new to this experience of flying an airplane. It's terrifying. Then to make matters a little bit better, they might combine that with what's called an engine out emergency. Now, I had an old school airplane instructor, and normally they just reduce the throttle. But what Josh liked to do was actually reduce the fuel-air mixture, cutting off fuel to the engine. So it was a very silent. There is no engine running. It's not like you took your foot off the accelerator. It's like you literally turned off the key. You can hear just the wind in this airplane. So it's very scary. And then later on, as you do your instrument training, they might put you into what's called an unusual attitude, where you wear the special goggles, and you can't even actually see the ground. All you can see is the instruments, and they'll tell you close your eyes, and they'll basically mess up the airplane, and then they'll tell you open your eyes, and you have to fix it. It's terrifying. And what a normal person would do in this situation is freak out. And as a CEO, you have to do what they teach you in airplane school, which is to calm down and work the checklist. I'm convinced that about half of the value of that training was simply to make you less freaked out when all these bad things are happening so that you can remain calm. Let me share a story from 2012. My current business, Upserve, was in the process of raising a Series B funding, and we had just done a big pivot with our product, and we had lined up a partner to enable a payments piece to our business. I was on my way back to the office from an unsuccessful pitch to a Series B investor. I came into my office. I sat down at the conference room table, and I knew there was a problem because my CFO and my VP of Business Development wanted to talk with me. And that didn't normally happen. I kind of had that taken to the principal's office feeling. Have you ever been there? So I sit down, and I've got about, maybe 4 to 6 months of runway left, cash in the bank. And we had big plans, though. We had it all figured out. The revenue strategy was going to be based on payments, and we had a partner lined up that was going to be our payments partner. And we've been working with them for a few months, and the launch was just a couple months away. Bad news. The partner reneged on the deal and is backing out. All of a sudden, I was brought back to my pilot training with Josh, up in the air with the and thinking about, okay, what do I need to do here? So I did actually freak out, but it was kind of in my mind. It wasn't expressed verbally. I sat down, And I thought about it, and one of the first things you do in this type of emergency in an airplane is you look for the nice patch of ground where you're gonna, the clean patch of dirt where you're gonna land the airplane while you work the problem. Because, hey, worst case scenario, we're gonna put it on the dirt. And so I was like, okay, I got 4 to 6 months, let's think about this. Okay, worst case scenario, here's how I'm gonna wind down the business. All right, now, let's start working the problem. By being able to stay calm and stay focused on the problem at hand, we came up with an action plan coming out of that stall warning meeting. And over the next few weeks, we actually lined up a better partner. Today, we run over 10 billion in payments volume through that partnership. To put that in perspective, a publicly traded company, Shopify, is doing about 14 billion in payments, and MindBody, another publicly traded company, is doing about 6 or 7. So it was successful, but the key thing was not freaking out and working the checklist and remaining calm. And as a CEO, as a founder, that's a superhuman skill that you need to develop, because most of your team will be freaking out. So you need to be the voice of reason and stay calm, cool, and collected. All right, so next I want to tell you another lesson I learned, which is called the 4 C's. Now, when you do your pilot training, you get to a point where instead of just doing your solo, which is kind of like when you go up and around the airport a few times and land, they actually let you fly somewhere. Since at the end of the day, that's why a lot of people that got into flying chose to do it. And they call that your cross-country flight. Now, along the way, you could get lost and other things could happen. You're outside the familiar habitat of the home airport. And one of the things you learn is what to do when you're in a problem. So when you first learn to fly, you're actually not supposed to fly into clouds. It's called visual flight rules versus instrument flight rules. So what would happen if you ever, though, were doing your first cross-country flight and you found yourself in a, oh crap, situation? Well, let me tell you an example when I was in that situation. It was 2001, and I had just got my pilot's license, and I was coming to land at Palo Alto Airport. And the Palo Alto tower told me that I was cleared to land, and I was number 4. This was a routine thing. I got in line, I saw a couple planes in front of me, and then I realized there was a problem. The problem was that I could only see 2 planes in front of me. So I was number 3, but I was supposed to be number 4, and I couldn't see number 3. What they teach you in pilot school is called the 4 C's. Climb, communicate, confess, comply. Well, in this situation, climbing wasn't necessary, but quickly get on the phone with the tower, well, the radio with the tower, explain the situation, swallow your pride, confess the problem, and then comply with what they tell you to do. As a CEO or as a founder, one of the things that makes you good at your job is to feel like you can see the world in a better way than it is today. You have this sort of little bit of hubris, frankly, to think that you've got the idea that's going to change the world. Sometimes that same trait, though, makes you less willing to admit that something's wrong or less willing to ask other people for help. A few years ago, in 2014, I was doing my Series C fundraising. And during the course of that, I made a mistake with one of my key employees, and I'll spare the details. But I was brought back to this particular lesson that I had learned. And basically, I'd misset one of my key executives' expectations around what was going to happen for them as a result of this financing. And I thought about it, and I was like, gee, I was tempted to try to just contain the problem and work it myself. But instead, what I decided to do was climb, basically up-level the conversation, communicate, see the big picture, up-level the conversation, communicate by engaging my board, asking them for help, clearly confessing what I had done wrong without trying to sugarcoat it, because frankly, being candid and direct is your friend here, and then working with them to solve the problem. Turned out it actually wasn't that big of a problem, but at the time going into it, it did seem that way. Basically, being a CEO doesn't mean you never need to ask for help. They teach you as a pilot, you're always the pilot in command. You can't abdicate that responsibility. The buck stops with you. But they also teach you to ask for help. Next, I want to talk a little bit about bad instruments, or when basically your business is lying to you in some fashion. As a pilot, nowadays, the instruments are a little bit more modern than when I was learning, call it 15 years ago. But essentially, there's 6 key instruments they teach you. In fact, they even call it the 6-pack of instruments. And one of the things that they teach you to do when you look at the instruments, as you heard earlier, is always trust your instruments, but sometimes 2 instruments may disagree. For example, in the top right, that tells you your altitude. And the bottom right tells you the rate at which you're climbing or descending. Well, if those 2 instruments were in disagreement, that would be a sign that something was wrong. The airspeed indicator on the top left is another one. Typically, when you're going down, it would be common that your airspeed might be increasing, and when you're climbing, it's not uncommon that your airspeed could actually decrease. The way the airspeed indicator works is that there's actually, believe it or not, even today, with like the most modern airliner, there's a little tube, like a little straw on the outside of the airplane facing forward, and it measures the difference in air pressure as air enters the tube versus another tube called the static tube, and it measures the difference in those two tube air pressures, and then that's how it can detect the airspeed. I'm oversimplifying it. I'm probably getting a little bit wrong, but I'm mostly right. That tube can actually fill up with ice. And if that tube fills up with ice, then the airplane airspeed indicator will be wrong. And if you follow that airspeed indicator, you will die. In fact, there was a plane crash in 2009 that killed over 220 people on an Air France flight from Rio de Janeiro to Paris because the pitot tube filled up with ice. So as a CEO, it's important to know when your instruments are lying to you. I'm going to give you two examples of this. In 2015, I remember being in a meeting with my head of sales and marketing, and he told me that things are going great with the SDR team because we keep on booking more and more and more meetings. But I noticed that the way we were measuring it was wrong. In fact, if I took a different measurement and looked at the unit productivity of my SDR team, I actually saw the productivity was going down, down, down. And so in that situation, I had a case where the two instruments didn't agree. And the way we were looking at the business, the way we were flying the airplane was wrong. So it's critically important that you have a few instruments and you design instruments that can cross-check each other as CEO so that you can know when your instruments are lying to you and so you don't die. All right, next I want to talk about key decisions. So what are key decisions? Key decisions are things like hiring an executive to your leadership team, deciding perhaps to sell the business or to do a large financing round, maybe deciding to discontinue an unsuccessful product, or potentially considering a significant ramp up in burn. When you're making a takeoff, thing is, takeoffs are optional, and these key decisions, these decisions that have high stakes and are very, very kind of deterministic to the outcome of the business, this is a takeoff. Now, we're taught to fail fast and try things, make things and break them, all those types of sayings, and that's great. But there are some decisions that aren't like that. Some decisions that are critical decisions, and you need to look at those very mindfully because those are a takeoff decision, and all takeoffs are optional. That's why, for example, it's better to never take off than to take off and die. So there is a point in the takeoff called V1. That's the point at which you're committed to the decision. In commercial jet airliner, if you ever sit up front, you'll actually be able to hear the pilots talking to each other during the takeoff. You'll hear them call the different speeds, V1, rotate, so on. V1 is the point of no return. At V1, you cannot stop the airplane. You are committed to the takeoff. Even if you lose a single engine, you are taking off the jet with a single engine to clear the obstacle and so on. So V1 is a critical point. I'll give you an example of V1 as it impacted me. I had raised this Series C financing in 2014. We had raised $20 million. We had a cool business at Upserve. It was going well, thousands of customers, millions in revenue, but we were still at a relatively small scale. We didn't have dozens of salespeople. We had single-digit salespeople. We had this idea that what was working with, call it 4 or 5 salespeople, was going to work just great if we ramped that up to 25 salespeople. So we raised all this money and we started hiring more salespeople, more marketing people, and so on. We started marching down the runway. It became clear to me, though, coming into the first quarter of 2015, that things weren't working as we had hoped. Yes, top-line growth was great, but I had another instrument that I was paying a lot of attention to. How fast was I recovering my customer acquisition cost? What was the lifetime value of a customer related to CAC? Things like that. Unit economics, not growth at all costs, but unit economics. And it was clear to me that those numbers are getting worse and worse and worse. And I basically remember being at this point and I felt like we were at V1. I could either commit to this path that I was on or make a dramatic change. I ended up deciding a very difficult decision, probably the most difficult decision I faced in the business at Upserve, which was to actually completely change course. We laid off about 30% of the team. We dramatically changed our go-to-market. And over the course of the next 6 months, I ended up having to actually replace most of my key executive leadership team, most importantly, bringing in a new person to lead our go-to-market, sales and marketing, and so on. But Fast forward to where we are now. Where we are now is we have multiple tens of millions in revenue. We're still doubling, but what's different is that our CAC is paid back in about 12 to 15 months, and LTV is about 6 times CAC. It's not growth at all costs. The key thing is knowing when you're at that V1 decision, because if you go past it without recognizing it, you've missed the opportunity to have an optionality in your takeoff. And I just want to close by noting, while all takeoffs are optional, landings are mandatory. Thank you very much. I really appreciate the opportunity.